A mountain man kisses a poor girl to save her life. And then everything changes. One moment, he's dragging her out of the snow, praying she'll breathe again. And the next, a strange glow on his lips marks him as a wanted thief. Suddenly, riders thunder down the mountain, lanterns blazing, hunting the wrong man. But the girl he saved carries a secret powerful enough to ruin a town, and dangerous enough to get them both killed. As church bells ring and dust rises in the street, he'll have to choose: run from the law or stand against it, because someone in the shadows wants the truth buried forever. What really happened the night the banker cried, "Thief"? And how far will a man go to protect a woman fate threw into his arms? When a single kiss marks him as an outlaw, what happens when the whole frontier turns against them? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The bitter winter wind howled through the Colorado high country, whipping snow into stinging clouds as Lucas Flint followed the familiar path of his trapline. His breaths came out in white puffs, crystallizing in his beard as he guided his horse through the deepening drifts. Years of experience had taught him to read the subtle signs of the wilderness, but today, something was different. The tracks he followed weren't those of fur-bearing creatures. They were human. He pulled his coat tighter, squinting against the biting cold. Through the swirling snow, a dark shape caught his eye. At first he thought it might be a fallen tree branch, but as he drew closer, his heart jumped. A woman lay half buried in the snow, her dress torn and frozen, her boots worn to practically nothing. Lucas dismounted quickly, his boots crunching in the snow as he rushed to her side. Her skin was pale as milk, lips tinged an alarming shade of blue. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, but barely, a faint flutter beneath ice-cold skin. "Ma'am?" he called, gently shaking her shoulder. No response. Working quickly, Lucas dragged her to the lee side of a large boulder, where the bitter wind couldn't reach them quite so fiercely. He checked again for breath, holding his hand close to her blue-tinged lips. Nothing. Panic gripped him. She was slipping away. Without hesitation, Lucas tilted her head back, pinched her nose, and pressed his mouth to hers. He forced air into her lungs once, twice, 3 times. The moments stretched like hours as he continued, silently praying between each breath he gave her. Suddenly, she jerked beneath his hands. A racking cough tore through her body, and her eyes flew open, wild with fear and confusion. She tried to push away from him, but her movements were weak and uncoordinated. "Easy now," Lucas soothed, helping her sit up. "You're safe. I'm Lucas Flint. Can you tell me your name?" Her teeth chattered as she wrapped her arms around herself. Mara, she managed. "Mara Ellery." "Miss Ellery, what happened? How'd you end up out here?" Terror flashed across her face. "Men," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They're hunting me. Say I'm a thief, but I'm not, I swear it." Her eyes darted around frantically, as if expecting her pursuers to materialize from the swirling snow. Lucas nodded slowly, keeping his voice calm and steady. "All right, Miss Ellery. First things first. We need to get you somewhere warm. My cabin's not far. Can you stand?" She tried, but her legs buckled immediately. Lucas caught her before she could fall, noting how light she felt in his arms, how the worn fabric of her dress offered little protection against the brutal cold. "Here's what we're going to do," he said, already leading his horse closer. "I'm going to help you up on my horse. You hold on tight as you can, and I'll walk alongside. It ain't far, but you've got to stay awake. Can you do that?" Mara nodded weakly. With as much care as he could manage, Lucas lifted her onto his horse. He removed his own heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, ignoring the bite of the wind through his wool shirt. As they began their slow journey, he kept one hand on the reins and the other on Mara's back, steadying her when she swayed. The sky was darkening toward dusk by the time his cabin came into view, a solid shadow against the white landscape. Lucas had never been so grateful to see those rough-hewn logs and the chimney that promised warmth within. He helped Mara down from the horse, practically carrying her the last few steps to the door. Inside, Lucas wasted no time. He settled Mara in his only chair while he quickly built up the fire, adding extra logs until the flames roared in the hearth. Her clothes were soaked through and frozen in places, a deadly combination in this weather. "Miss Ellery," he said gently, "your clothes are frozen. They need to come off, or you'll never get warm properly." He saw fear flash in her eyes and quickly added, "I'll be nothing but respectful, you have my word. But this is about survival now." She nodded slightly, understanding the gravity of the situation. With rough but careful hands, Lucas helped remove her outer layers, the frozen dress, the sodden petticoat, keeping his eyes averted as much as possible while maintaining efficiency. He wrapped her in every quilt he owned, building a cocoon of warmth around her trembling form. "There now," he said, stoking the fire again. "Just rest. You're safe here." Mara's eyes were already closing, exhaustion finally claiming her as the warmth began to seep into her bones. Lucas watched her for a moment, ensuring her breathing had steadied, before turning away to hang her wet clothes by the fire to dry. As he moved, something caught his eye in the dim lamplight, a strange gleam along his lips, barely visible but unmistakably there. He touched it with his fingertips, puzzled. Behind him, he heard Mara stir, and when he turned to look at her, the horror in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She recognized whatever this substance was, and its presence terrified her. Time seemed to freeze as they stared at each other, the fire crackling between them, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. The wind howled outside, but inside, silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Lucas could see the moment Mara's fear transformed into something deeper. Guilt, perhaps, or despair. He wanted to ask what it meant, this strange, gleaming mark that now connected them, but the exhaustion etched in every line of her face stopped him. Whatever secrets she carried, whatever danger pursued her, those questions could wait until morning. For now she needed rest, and he needed to think. Lucas moved to the other side of the cabin, settling onto his bedroll near the door. He would keep watch through the night, his rifle close at hand. As the fire's warmth filled the small space, he studied the mysterious woman who fate had dropped in his path. There was more to her story, much more. But his years in the mountains had taught him patience. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles. Tonight they were safe from the storm, if not from whatever shadows pursued Mara Ellery through the Colorado wilderness. He touched his lips again, feeling that faint, foreign shimmer. Whatever mark she had inadvertently passed to him when he breathed life back into her frozen body, he sensed it would change everything. The question was, how? The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind continued its mournful song through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the rising moon. Lucas settled in for a long night of watchfulness, his mind full of questions, but his heart certain of one thing. He had done right by helping this woman, regardless of what consequences might follow. First light crept through the cabin's lone window, painting pale stripes across the rough-hewn floorboards. The small space smelled of wood smoke and coffee, the latter bubbling in a battered pot on the iron stove where Lucas stood, occasionally stirring the dark brew with a wooden spoon. He glanced toward his bunk where Mara slept, still wrapped in his quilts. Her face had regained some color overnight, though worry lines creased her forehead even in sleep. Her clothes, now dry, lay folded on a chair near the fire. The coffee pot rattled, and Mara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, confusion clouded her features before recognition dawned. She pulled the quilts tighter around herself as she sat up. "Morning," Lucas said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Coffee's almost ready, if you're of a mind." Mara nodded, then froze as her gaze fixed on his face. "Oh no," she whispered, her voice thick with dread. "It's still there." Lucas touched his lips where that strange gleam had appeared the night before. "Reckon you know what this is?" "Please," Mara begged. "Don't touch it. It'll only make it worse." She struggled to sit up straighter, clutching the quilts to her chest. It's called contact ink. The Pinkertons use it." Lucas's hand dropped to his side. He'd heard of Pinkerton detectives, of course. Most frontier folks had. They were hired guns with badges, working for banks and railroads more often than justice. He poured 2 cups of coffee and carried one to Mara, keeping his distance as he handed it to her. "Tell me," he said simply, settling onto a wooden stool. Mara wrapped her trembling hands around the tin cup. "They use it to mark people they're tracking. Suspects, thieves." Her voice caught. "It transfers by touch. That's why they—" She trailed off, shame coloring her cheeks. "That's why they what?" Lucas prompted gently. Before she could answer, the distinctive crunch of hoofbeats in snow cut through the morning quiet. Lucas moved with the fluid grace of a mountain cat, setting down his coffee and reaching for his old Sharps rifle in one smooth motion. "Stay inside," he murmured to Mara. "Keep quiet." He stepped out onto the small porch, rifle held casually but ready. 3 riders sat their horses in the clearing before his cabin, their breath and their mounts creating clouds in the crisp morning air. One held a bullseye lantern, unusual for daylight hours. "Morning," Lucas called, keeping his voice even. "Long ride to make this early." The man with the lantern urged his horse forward a few steps. His coat bore no obvious badge, but his bearing screamed lawman. He lifted the lantern, directing its beam toward Lucas's face. Lucas felt rather than saw the ink on his lips react, giving off that faint, telltale gleam. The rider's expression hardened. "Well now," the man said, his tone deceptively mild. "Interesting morning indeed." He shifted in his saddle, hand resting near his holster. "Been tracking a marked thief through these parts. Seems we've found our quarry." Lucas leaned against his doorframe, the picture of unconcerned mountain man. "That so?" He kept his rifle pointed at the ground, but his finger rested near the trigger. "Been trapping these hills alone all season. Ask anyone in town." The second rider spoke up. "That mark says different." "Does it now?" Lucas drawled. "Funny thing about living alone in the mountains. Man tends to try all sorts of home remedies for chapped lips. Maybe whatever I used didn't agree with me." The third rider snorted, but the man with the lantern studied Lucas carefully. Lucas met his gaze steadily, letting the weight of his reputation do the talking. Everyone in 3 counties knew Lucas Flint. Mountain man, former bank guard's brother, a man whose word carried weight. After a long moment, the lead rider lowered his lantern. "Maybe so," he said slowly. "But we'll be asking around about those home remedies of yours." He gathered his reins. "Good day, Mr. Flint." Lucas touched the brim of his hat, watching as the 3 riders turned their mounts and headed down the snow-filled hollow. He stayed on the porch until they disappeared around the bend, their hoofbeats fading into the morning stillness. Only then did he step back inside, closing the door against the cold. Mara stood by the fire, still wrapped in quilts, her face pale with fear. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen. Now they think you're—" "They think what they want to think," Lucas interrupted gently. "Right now we need to figure out our next move. They'll be back, sure as sunrise." Mara sank into the chair by the fire, her shoulders slumping. "I should leave. They'll bring more men next time, maybe the sheriff too." "In this weather? That'd be certain death?" Lucas shook his head. "No, we'll figure this out together." He paused, studying her drawn face. "But I need to know the truth, Miss Ellery. All of it." The day passed slowly, filled with necessary tasks. Lucas checked his trapline, brought in more firewood, and tended to his horse. Mara insisted on helping despite her lingering weakness, straightening the cabin and mending a tear in Lucas's spare shirt with neat, practiced stitches that spoke of her seamstress background. They spoke little, both lost in thought, both aware of the weight of decisions to come. As evening drew near, Lucas built up the fire against the coming night. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as he settled onto his bedroll near the door, his rifle within easy reach. In the quiet, broken only by the pop and crackle of burning wood, Lucas closed his eyes. His lips moved silently at first, then whispered words emerged, halting and rough with disuse. "Lord," he murmured, "ain't talked to you much since James died. Maybe you noticed." He paused, searching for words. "But I reckon I need some wisdom here. Show me how to help her. Show me what's right." The prayer felt awkward, like a tool long unused, but something in Lucas's chest loosened with the speaking of it. Across the cabin, Mara's breathing had grown steady with sleep. Lucas opened his eyes, watching the flames dance until their hypnotic movement drew him down into uneasy dreams of his own. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the tracker's hoofprints, while the moon rose cold and clear over the Colorado high country. In the cabin, two people slept, one running from a past marked in invisible ink, the other newly branded with her secrets, while somewhere in the darkness, 3 riders plotted their return. Lucas pressed his shoulder against the cabin door, testing its strength against the rising wind. Snow whispered against the rough-hewn logs, growing heavier by the hour. The storm that had threatened since dawn was finally settling in for true, and from the look of the clouds, it meant to stay a while. He turned back to find Mara awake, sitting up in his bunk with one of his old quilts wrapped tight around her shoulders. Color had returned to her cheeks, though she still shivered despite the fire he'd built up high. Her eyes followed him as he moved around the small cabin, checking the window shutters and adding another log to the stove. "Smells like snow," he said, breaking the morning silence. "The heavy kind." Mara nodded, then coughed softly. "How long might it last?" "Could be hours. Could be days." Lucas reached for the iron pot hanging near the stove. "Best we get some food in you while we can. I've got rabbit stew left from yesterday." He ladled the warmed stew into 2 tin bowls, handed one to Mara, then settled onto his wooden stool. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of spoons against tin and the growing howl of wind outside. Lucas watched her eat, noting how her hands had steadied since yesterday. "Miss Ellery," he said finally, keeping his voice gentle. "Reckon it's time we talked about what brought you up this mountain." Mara's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down slowly, staring into her bowl as if the answers might be floating there among the vegetables and meat. "I suppose I owe you that much," she said quietly. "After all you've done." She drew a deep breath, then raised her eyes to meet his. How much do you know about Silas Grady? Lucas's jaw tightened at the name. Banker down in Copper Bend, church elder, man who likes to own things and people. Yes, Mara's fingers twisted in the quilt. I did sewing for his wife, mending mostly. Good work when I could get it. But then, she swallowed hard. Then he asked me to deliver a sealed packet, said it was payroll for the mining company. Outside, the wind moaned through the pines. Lucas waited, something cold settling in his chest. Only there wasn't any payroll, Mara continued. The packet was empty. He'd already taken the money, but he needed someone to blame. Her voice shook. He had my sewing scissors treated with that contact ink while I was working at his house. When I touched them next, she gestured helplessly at Lucas's marked lips. That's why the Pinkertons came after you, Lucas said, pieces falling into place. But they didn't have a proper warrant? Mara shook her head. They came at night, with guns. No papers, no sheriff, just Grady pointing his finger and calling me thief. Her eyes filled with tears. I ran. What else could I do? No one in town would believe my word over his. Lucas set his bowl aside, his appetite gone. The timing nagged at him, clicking against memories he'd rather forget. When did this happen? 3 days ago, though it feels like weeks now. 3 days. Lucas stood abruptly, pacing the small space. My brother James, he worked as a guard at Grady's bank. 4 months back, they found him dead below the high trestle. Said he fell. He turned to face Mara. But James knew every board of that bridge, crossed it twice daily for years. Mara's face had gone pale. Mr. Flint. Lucas, he corrected automatically. Lucas, she amended. Are you saying? I'm saying nothing sits right about any of this. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to order his thoughts. James was acting strange those last few weeks, worried about something at the bank. Then suddenly he's dead, and Grady's men are all over that bridge before the sheriff even arrives. The wind rose to a roar, rattling the shutters. Mara pulled the quilt tighter, though Lucas suspected her shiver had little to do with cold. We need to think careful about our next move, he said, returning to his stool. Can't stay here forever. Storm's building and supplies won't last long with 2 mouths to feed. Mara set her bowl aside. What are our choices? Could push deeper into the mountains. Lucas gestured toward the west. I know places they'd never find us, but winter's setting in hard. It'd be a rough go. Or we find someone outside town politics, someone who can't be bought. Lucas rubbed his jaw, thinking. Henry Ten Snow, maybe. He works as translator up at the reservation agency. Known him years. Honest man, sees clear. An Indian? Mara's voice held surprise, but no prejudice. Apache, Lucas corrected. White Mountain Band. He understands both sides of the law, and he's got connections in the territorial court. He paused, studying her face. But first we need to weather this storm. Rising, he moved to check his storage chest. The inventory was concerning. Half a sack of flour, some dried beans, jerky, coffee, and precious little else. He'd meant to make a supply run to town next week, before the winter storm set in proper. The lamp flame wavered as another gust rattled the cabin. Lucas trimmed the wick, conserving oil, while Mara coughed again, a deeper sound this time that made him frown. Best try to rest, he told her. Storm's not going anywhere soon. She nodded, settling back against his rolled blanket. Lucas? Thank you, for believing me. He turned from the lamp, meeting her eyes in the dimness. Truth's got a certain feel to it, my pa used to say. Yours rings true. Mara managed a small smile before closing her eyes. Lucas moved to the window, pushing aside the shutter's edge to peer out at the swirling white. The snow was falling heavier now, straight down in the way that meant business. Come morning, they'd likely be drifted in. He let the shutter fall back into place and settled into his chair, rifle across his knees. The wind's howl rose and fell like something alive, while Mara's soft coughing punctuated the darkness. Lucas stared into the night, every sense alert. Something bigger than a storm was brewing. He could feel it in his bones, same as he'd felt it 4 months ago when they'd brought him word about James. The lamp guttered, throwing strange shadows on the log walls. Outside, snow continued to fall, erasing their tracks and sealing them in, while somewhere below in Copper Bend, a banker named Grady planned his next move, not knowing that his carefully laid scheme had just tangled with a mountain man's quest for truth. The storm broke just before dawn. Lucas woke to an unfamiliar silence, the absence of wind that had howled for days. Pale blue light filtered through the cabin's shutters, and his breath frosted in the cold air as he eased from his chair, careful not to wake Mara. He pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside, boots crunching in fresh powder. The sun was just clearing the eastern ridge, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose. The air held that special brittleness that came after big storms, sharp enough to burn his lungs. Lucas moved carefully around the cabin's perimeter, reading the night's story written in the snow. Rabbit tracks crossed near the woodpile. A fox had investigated his smokehouse, but it was the horse sign along the distant ridge that caught his attention. Even from here, he could make out where 3 riders had passed, watching, waiting. Pinkertons, he muttered, his breath clouding. They weren't giving up easily. Back inside, he found Mara awake and trying to sit up. Her face was flushed, and when she coughed, the sound was deeper, wetter than before. Lucas crossed to the bunk and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. The heat radiating from her skin made him frown. "Fever's up," he said quietly. Mara pushed his hand away. "I'm fine. Just need to get moving." She swung her legs over the side of the bunk, but swayed when she tried to stand. Lucas caught her shoulders, easing her back down. "Easy now," he said. "No sense rushing." "But the Pinkertons are still out there, yes." Lucas moved to the stove, adding wood and setting coffee to boil. "Which is why we need to think smart, not just run blind." While the coffee perked, he explained his plan. "I've got a friend at the reservation agency, Henry Ten Snow. Known him going on 15 years now. He works as a translator there, helps sort out treaty matters between the Apache and the government men." Mara wrapped her quilt tighter, watching him with fever-bright eyes. "How far?" 3 days' ride in good weather." Lucas poured coffee into tin cups, handed one to Mara. "Henry knows federal law better than most lawyers, and he's got no love for men like Grady who steal land through false papers. More important, he can't be bought." Hope flickered across Mara's face. Someone who might actually listen. And know what to do about it. Lucas sipped his coffee. "Henry's got connections with the territorial court, too. If anyone can help us expose Grady's schemes, it's him." Mara nodded, then doubled over with another coughing spell. When it passed, she straightened with visible effort. "When do we leave?" Lucas studied her face, the hectic color in her cheeks, the shadows under her eyes. "First, let's see if you can stand." He helped her up slowly. For a moment she seemed steady, but then her knees buckled. Lucas caught her before she could fall, feeling the tremors running through her body. "I can do it," she insisted, but her voice shook. "I have to." "Not like this." Lucas helped her back to the bunk. "That cough's settling in your chest. 3 days through mountain country, in this cold? It'd kill you sure as any bullet." Then you go. Mara's fingers twisted in the quilt. Find your friend. Bring help. I'll manage here. Lucas shook his head. Can't leave you alone. Not with those men circling. They'd find the cabin soon enough. He paced the small room, thinking hard. No, we need another way. Through the window, he watched the sun climb higher, casting long blue shadows across the snow. The day would be clear but bitter cold. Already he could see fresh tracks up on the ridge, the Pinkertons making their morning rounds. Maybe, he said slowly. Running isn't the answer anyway. Mara looked up sharply. What do you mean? Lucas settled into his chair, leaning forward. Way I see it, Grady's counting on us either getting caught or disappearing. Either way suits him fine. He keeps his reputation clean, keeps whatever he's hiding buried deep. Like what happened to your brother, Mara said softly. Lucas nodded, grief and anger mixing in his chest. James wasn't one for falling. Not off bridges he knew better than his own name. But Grady's men were there awful quick after it happened, making sure no one looked too close. You think he was killed? I think my brother saw something he wasn't supposed to. Same as you. Lucas's voice hardened. And I think it's time someone stood and faced Grady straight on, brought everything into the light. Mara's eyes widened. That's dangerous talk. More dangerous to keep running. Lucas stood and moved to the window, watching the sun sparkle off the fresh snow. Sooner or later, he'll send more than just Pinkertons. We need to gather proof, find others he's wronged, build a case strong enough that even his money can't bury it. Another coughing spell seized Mara, and Lucas waited until it passed before continuing. First, though, we need to get you well. Can't fight for justice if you're fighting for breath. He spent the next hour gathering supplies, willow bark for her fever, honey for her cough, the last of his dried herbs. The sun climbed higher, flooding the cabin with cold light. Lucas checked his rifle, cleaned his revolver, and sorted through his ammunition. Whatever came next, they'd need to be ready. By mid-afternoon, Mara's fever was climbing again. Lucas helped her sip water and herbal tea, watching with growing concern as she drifted in and out of sleep. Outside, the temperature dropped with the sun, and he could hear the crack of freezing branches in the forest. As evening approached, he banked the fire carefully, not so high as to show through chinks in the walls, but enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay. He pulled his chair closer to the bunk, rifle across his knees, and settled in for another night of watching. Mara stirred, her eyes opening. Lucas? Right here. Thank you, she whispered, for not just hiding me away somewhere, for wanting to make it right. Lucas thought of his brother, of all the questions that had haunted him these past months. Hiding doesn't heal anything. Truth might hurt worse at first, but it's the only way forward. Mara nodded slightly, then closed her eyes again. Her breathing was rough but steady, and Lucas watched the firelight play across her face as she slipped back into uneasy sleep. Outside, night was falling fast and cold, stars pricking through the darkening sky like ice crystals. He settled deeper into his chair, prepared for another long vigil. Whatever Grady had done, whatever he was hiding, it had cost James his life and nearly cost Mara hers. The time for running was past. Now was the time for standing ground, for bringing dark deeds into daylight. Lucas checked his rifle one more time, then turned his attention to the window, watching the moon rise over the snow-covered ridge. Somewhere out there, Pinkerton men were making their rounds, and below in Copper Bend, Silas Grady slept easy in his fine house, believing his secrets safe and his enemies scattered. But things were about to change. Lucas would make sure of that, just as soon as Mara was strong enough to ride. For now, though, All he could do was keep watch through the long night, guarding against whatever tomorrow might bring. Morning came soft and pale through the cabin windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of white that stretched unbroken to the tree line. Lucas stood at the door, coffee cup steaming in his hand, and studied the crystalline landscape. The snow lay deep, too deep for safe travel, especially with Mara burning up with fever. He glanced back at her sleeping form in the bunk. Her face was flushed, hair dark with sweat against the pillow. Through the night, her temperature had climbed steadily, despite the willow bark tea he'd brewed. Moving quietly, Lucas gathered clean rags and stepped outside. The morning air bit sharp and clean as he scooped fresh snow into his tin basin. Back inside, he wrung out a cloth in the melting snow and laid it gently across Mara's forehead. She stirred, eyes fluttering open. "Cold," she mumbled. "That's the idea." Lucas re-wet the cloth. "Need to bring that fever down." Mara tried to sit up but fell back, weak as a new lamb. "How long was I sleeping?" "Most of the night." He held a cup of water to her lips. "Small sips now." She managed a few swallows before turning her head away. Her breathing was labored, each inhale catching roughly in her chest. Lucas frowned at the sound. That cough was getting worse, not better. The day settled into a quiet rhythm. Lucas tended the fire, melted snow for drinking water, and checked his dwindling supplies. Every hour or so, he changed the cool cloths on Mara's face and neck, coaxing her to drink whenever she woke. By afternoon, he had a pot of broth simmering on the stove, filling the cabin with the rich scent of herbs and dried meat. "Smells good," Mara whispered when she next stirred. Lucas helped her sit up, propping her with his extra pillow. "Think you can manage some?" She nodded, though her hands shook too much to hold the cup steady. Lucas sat on the edge of the bunk and held it for her, watching as she took careful sips. "My mother," she said after a while. "She used to make chicken soup when I was sick. Before—" her voice trailed off. "Before what?" Mara's eyes grew distant. "Before Father died. We lost everything. The house, the store, most of our things. Moved to the poorest part of Copperbend." She gave a bitter laugh that turned into coughing. "The church ladies, they used to visit all the sick folks with food and prayers. But when Mother took ill that first winter, they never came. Said they couldn't waste resources on people like us." Lucas's jaw tightened. "That ain't Christian behavior?" "No." Mara sipped more broth. "Mother died that spring. I've sewn for the church ladies ever since, mending their fine dresses while they pretend not to remember." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly. Outside, a late afternoon wind kicked up, rattling the cabin's shutters. "After James died," Lucas said finally, "I stopped going to services. Couldn't stand the empty words, all that talk of God's plan." He stared into the flames. "My faith went quiet, like a stream freezing over in winter. Still there underneath, maybe, but—" He shrugged. Mara touched his arm briefly. Would you read to me? From your Bible? It's been so long since I heard the words without judgment behind them." Lucas retrieved the worn book from his pack. The leather was cracked, pages dog-eared from years of trail reading. He settled back in his chair and opened to a familiar passage. "The Lord is my shepherd," he read softly. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." The words filled the small cabin as evening drew in. When Mara drifted off again, Lucas kept reading silently to himself, finding an odd comfort in the familiar verses. Days passed slowly. Lucas fell into a routine of caring for Mara between necessary chores. He chopped wood, checked his trap lines, and regularly scanned the ridgeline for riders. The Pinkertons were still out there, he knew, but the deep snow kept them to the main trails for now. Each morning and evening, he helped Mara sit up for broth and tea. Her fever rose and fell like the tide, but gradually the peaks grew less severe. Her cough remained troublesome, but the wet rattle in her chest began to ease. They talked in the quiet hours, careful conversations that skirted the edges of deeper wounds. Lucas learned she had a gift for remembering poetry. Mara discovered he could identify birds just by their calls. Simple things, shared carefully, building trust one small revelation at a time. On the third evening, Mara's fever finally broke. Lucas found her sitting up in the bunk, color returning to her cheeks. "I want to do something useful," she declared. "I've been lying here for days while you've done everything." "You've been healing," Lucas pointed out. "That's plenty useful." But Mara was already eyeing his trail pack, which sat worn and torn by the door. "At least let me mend that. It's what I do, after all." Lucas brought her his sewing kit and the old pack. The leather was scratched, one strap hanging by threads, with various tears along the seams. Mara clicked her tongue at the state of it. "How long have you been carrying this?" "Years." Lucas watched as she threaded a needle with practiced ease. "It was James's first. He gave it to me when I started running my own trap lines." Mara worked steadily in the lamplight, her stitches small and even. She turned the pack inside out to reinforce a failing seam, then paused. "There's something—" Her fingers probed carefully at the lining. "Feel this." Lucas leaned closer. In the shadows of the pack's interior, something crinkled. Mara gently worked her fingers into a small tear in the lining and drew out an envelope, stained and weathered with age. Lucas stared at it. "That wasn't there before. At least I never knew about it." The envelope was sealed but clearly old, the paper softened and discolored by years of being hidden in the pack. There was no writing visible on the outside. Mara held it up to the lamplight. "Should I—" Lucas nodded slowly, his throat tight. "Open it." With careful fingers, Mara began to break the seal. The worn envelope crackled as Mara's careful fingers worked it open. Lucas leaned closer to the lamplight, his breath catching as she drew out a folded paper, its edges water-stained and softened by time. The sheet was covered in neat columns of numbers and notes, the handwriting instantly familiar. "That's James's writing," Lucas whispered, his voice rough. He'd know those precise, slanted letters anywhere. His brother had always taken pride in his clear penmanship. Mara smoothed the page carefully on her lap. The ledger paper was filled with rows of figures, dates, and brief notations. "These look like bank records," she said softly. Lucas nodded, scanning the columns. "James kept the night books at Grady's bank. Said it helped him stay alert during guard shifts." His finger traced down one column of numbers. "Look here. Deposits recorded, then moved. Large amounts vanishing from Widow Johnston's account, reappearing in something called special holdings." Mara's hands trembled slightly as she pointed to another entry. "These dates, they match when the mining company's payroll went missing. The funds Grady accused me of stealing." Her voice caught. "But according to this, the money was already gone before I even touched that packet." Together they studied the damning evidence, piecing together the pattern. Week after week, James had documented discrepancies. Pension funds drained from elderly accounts, foreclosure payments that never reached the territorial office, mining claims redirected through shell companies, all leading back to Grady's private accounts. At the bottom of the page, a hasty note was scrawled in James's hand. "Meeting Fed, Marshall Turner next week. Must show proof of—" The line ended abruptly. Lucas's hands clenched into fists. He never made that meeting. 2 days later, they found him at the bottom of Eagle Creek Trestle. His voice was barely audible. Said he must have lost his footing in the dark. Oh, Lucas. Mara's eyes filled with tears. She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. He was trying to expose the truth, and Grady had him killed for it. The words came out like ground glass. My own brother, murdered for doing what was right. Lucas stood abruptly, pacing the small cabin. I knew something wasn't adding up. James never drank, never took foolish risks. He wouldn't have fallen. Mara watched him move, her own tears falling freely now. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Your brother was a good man. He tried to stop this. Lucas stopped at the window, staring out into the darkness. And now we have proof. Proof of what Grady's been doing to folks all over the territory. He turned back to Mara. This is what Henry needs to see. With his knowledge of federal law, he'll know how to get this in front of the right authorities. Henry 10 Snow, the Apache translator you mentioned? Mara carefully refolded the precious document. Yes. He works at the reservation agency in Shadow Valley, deals with government men regular. More important, he can't be bought. Lucas's jaw set with determination. Soon as first light comes, we need to ride. The night passed slowly. Neither could sleep much, their minds racing with the weight of what they'd discovered. Lucas checked his gear and ammunition, while Mara reinforced the remaining weak spots in his pack. The ledger page was carefully wrapped in oilcloth and tucked deep inside. Dawn brought bitter cold and crystalline skies. Lucas had just finished saddling his horse when a weak knock sounded at the cabin door. He exchanged a quick glance with Mara, who gripped the rifle he'd left by the bunk. Hello, the cabin, a man's voice called, rough with exhaustion. Please, we need help. Lucas opened the door cautiously to find a young couple standing in the snow. The woman held a small child, maybe 4 years old, bundled in a threadbare blanket. All three were pale with cold, their clothes worn thin. Thank the Lord, the man breathed. We've been walking since yesterday, lost our way after. He swallowed hard. After they put us off our claim. Get inside, Lucas said, stepping back. Mara, we need coffee and soup heated. The family huddled near the stove, while Lucas and Mara worked quickly. Soon they had hot coffee for the parents and warm broth for the child. The man introduced himself as Tom Whitaker, his wife as Sarah, and their daughter as Jenny. We had a small silver claim up Cedar Creek way, Tom explained between spoonfuls of soup. Nothing rich, but we were making enough to get by. Then last week, Grady's men showed up with papers saying we were in default on our loan. Sarah clutched her daughter closer. We tried to explain we'd made every payment on time, but they said the terms had changed, that we owed 3 times what we'd borrowed. Her voice broke. They gave us an hour to clear out. Grady's been doing the same all over, Tom added bitterly. Widow Reynolds lost her place last month. The Martinez family, too. Anyone who can't fight back in court. Lucas and Mara shared a long look over the steam of the soup pot. More victims of Grady's schemes, more lives torn apart by his greed. You can rest here today, Lucas said. Get warm, get your bearings. I know these mountains. I can point you toward the stage road tomorrow. The Whitakers protested weakly, but exhaustion won out. Lucas helped them make pallets near the stove with spare blankets. Soon the family was sleeping soundly, little Jenny curled between her parents. As the sun rose higher, Lucas and Mara finished their preparations in quiet efficiency. The ledger was secure, supplies packed, the horse ready. Lucas left clear instructions for the Whitakers on getting to the stage road, along with some of his dried meat and coffee. They set out just after dawn the next day, guiding the Whitakers as far as the main trail before turning back. The family's gratitude was profound, though Lucas waved off their thanks. "Just remember what Grady did," he told them quietly. "Remember, and be ready to speak truth when the time comes." Back at the cabin, Mara was waiting with the horse saddled. The morning air was knife-sharp, their breath forming clouds in the sunlight. Lucas helped Mara mount, then swung up behind her. "It's a 3-day ride to Henry's Valley," he said, gathering the reins. "Weather holds, we should make good time." Mara leaned back slightly against his chest, sharing warmth. "We're not just running anymore, are we?" "No." Lucas urged the horse forward, leaving the cabin behind. "Now we're riding toward something. Toward justice. For James, for you, for all the folks Grady's hurt." They moved steadily through the glittering morning, the horses' hooves breaking trail through unmarked snow. Behind them, thin smoke still rose from the cabin's chimney, a final gift of warmth for the displaced family within. Ahead lay Henry's Valley and the hope of making things right at last. Lucas felt the weight of James's ledger against his chest, his brother's final testimony safely hidden away. The truth would come to light, he vowed silently, and Silas Grady would answer for every life he'd broken in his ruthless climb to power. The sun climbed higher as they rode, casting their single shadow across the pristine snow. Each step carried them closer to Henry 10 Snow, and the chance to bring Grady's crimes into the light at last. The mountain trail twisted through stands of snow-laden pine, narrow and treacherous in the winter morning. Lucas's horse picked its way carefully through the drifts, steam rising from its flanks despite the cold. Behind Lucas in the saddle, Mara held tight to his middle, her cheek pressed against his coat for warmth. "You holding up all right?" Lucas asked, feeling her shiver. "Yes," Mara answered, though her voice was muffled by cold. "Just need to rest soon." Lucas nodded, scanning ahead for suitable shelter. The horse couldn't manage this deep snow forever, and Mara still wasn't fully recovered from her fever. They'd been traveling since dawn, and the sun now stood high overhead, casting sharp shadows across the pristine white landscape. After another hour, he guided them into a small clearing where a fallen pine created a natural windbreak. "We'll stop here," he said, helping Mara down from the saddle. Her legs trembled as she found her footing in the snow. While Lucas tended to the horse, removing the bit so it could rest and offering it a handful of oats, Mara stamped her feet and rubbed her arms to restore circulation. The cold had settled deep in her bones during the morning's ride. "Need to get you warm," Lucas said, returning to her side. "Time you learned to build a proper mountain fire?" He showed her how to clear a space in the snow down to bare earth, explaining each step as he worked. "Start with small dry twigs," he demonstrated, breaking dead branches into finger-length pieces. "Then stack larger pieces around them like a little cabin." Mara watched intently as he arranged the wood. "Why not just pile it all together?" "Fire needs to breathe," Lucas explained. "Air needs to flow through, feed the flames." He struck a match and touched it to his tinder. "See how the small stuff catches first, then spreads to the bigger pieces?" Soon they had a cheerful blaze going, its warmth a blessing in the winter air. Lucas showed Mara how to feed it properly, adding larger logs once the base was established. She tried maintaining it herself, laughing softly when the smoke suddenly shifted and chased her around the fire ring. "Smoke follows beauty," my mother used to say. Lucas commented, then looked away quickly, as if surprised by his own words. Mara felt her cheeks warm, and not just from the flames. "Your mother sounds wise." They shared a simple meal of jerky and hard biscuits, letting the fire's heat soak into their tired bodies. The horse dozed nearby, nose buried in the feed bag Lucas had provided. "We should reach Henry's Valley in 2 more days," Lucas said, studying the sky. "Weather holds, anyway." Mara nodded, grateful for the rest, but anxious about the miles still ahead. "Will your friend truly be able to help us?" "Henry Ten Snow's probably the most honest man I know," Lucas replied. "And he understands both sides of things, white man's law and Apache wisdom." He poked at the fire with a stick. "If anyone can help us use that ledger to bring Grady down proper, it's Henry." They resumed their journey after the brief rest, Mara's arms once again wrapped around Lucas's middle as they navigated the mountain trail. The afternoon passed in a rhythm of steady travel, punctuated by necessary stops to rest the horse and stamp feeling back into cold feet. As dusk approached, Lucas guided them into a sheltered grove of pines. "We'll make camp here," he said, helping Mara dismount. "Good protection from the wind and plenty of deadfall for firewood." He showed her how to gather pine boughs, demonstrating how to layer them to create insulation from the cold ground. "Pile them thick," he instructed. "More you put down, softer you'll sleep." Mara worked alongside him, learning the art of mountain survival one lesson at a time. When Lucas declared they had enough boughs, he taught her how to arrange their bedrolls atop the makeshift mattress. "Keep your clothes inside the blankets," he advised. "They'll be warmer to put on come morning." They shared another simple meal by the fire, and Lucas told her stories of his years in the mountains, tales of spring floods and autumn storms, of tracking elk through deep snow and finding honey trees in summer. His quiet voice painted pictures of a life lived close to the land, both harsh and beautiful. The night sky spread above them like black velvet scattered with diamonds, more stars than Mara had ever seen in town. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Lucas took first watch while Mara slept, his rifle across his knees as he listened to the night sounds of the mountain. Later, he gently woke her for her turn, showing her how to keep the fire fed without letting it flare too bright. The next day brought clearer skies, but bitter cold. They were breaking camp when hoofbeats approached on the trail. Lucas motioned Mara to stay behind him as a small army patrol emerged from the trees. 6 men led by a sergeant, all wearing heavy winter uniforms. "Morning," the sergeant called, reining his horse to a stop. "Mighty cold for traveling?" "That it is," Lucas replied, neutrally, his posture relaxed but alert. The sergeant's eyes moved from Lucas to Mara, then back. "You folks headed toward the reservation?" "Passing near it," Lucas said. "Taking my wife to visit family." The lie came smooth and easy, protecting them both. The sergeant nodded slowly. "Best be careful. Been some tensions lately between settlers and Apache. Nothing serious yet, but you know how things can turn." "Much obliged for the warning," Lucas responded, his tone giving away nothing. The sergeant studied them a moment longer, but saw only what Lucas intended, a mountain man and his tired wife, nothing to concern a military patrol. With a touch to his hat brim, he signaled his men forward, and the patrol moved on down the trail. Once the soldiers were well away, Mara released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "That was close," she whispered. "Not really," Lucas said, helping her mount. "Army patrols don't look too hard at folks heading away from trouble." But his eyes followed the patrol's tracks until they disappeared around a bend. They traveled steadily through the day, stopping occasionally to rest and warm themselves. As evening approached, they made camp in another protected hollow, and Lucas showed Mara more wilderness skills, how to judge dead wood by its sound when struck, how to bank a fire to last through the night. The stars emerged one by one as darkness fell, filling the sky with their cold fire. Mara sat wrapped in her blanket, watching the flames dance and thinking about all that had happened since Lucas found her in the snow. Quietly, almost hesitantly, she began to pray. It had been years since she'd last spoken to God, not since the church ladies had turned her mother away. But here, under the vast sky, words came naturally. "Thank you," she whispered, "for keeping me alive, for sending Lucas, for giving us a chance at justice." She paused, tears pricking at her eyes. "Please help us find the right path, and thank you for letting me feel hope again." Lucas, tending the horses nearby, heard her soft words but remained where he was, respecting the private moment. His own faith had gone silent after James's death, but something stirred in his heart at Mara's simple prayer. They rose before dawn on the third day, breaking camp in the gray light before sunrise. As they mounted up, the eastern sky began to lighten, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. The trail wound upward, and as the sun cleared the horizon, they reached the crest of a long rise. Lucas reined the horse to a stop, and Mara gasped softly at the view before them. Below stretched a sheltered valley, still wrapped in morning shadow. And there, rising against the dark pines, was a thin line of smoke, marking Henry X Snow's winter lodge and the hope of justice it represented. They sat quietly for a moment, watching that promising thread of smoke rise into the morning air. Everything they had endured, the cold, the fear, the long journey, had led them to this moment. Now they would learn if Henry X Snow could help them transform James's ledger from evidence into justice. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Lucas guided their horse down the winding trail. Mara held tight to his waist, both from the steep descent and the nervous flutter in her stomach. After days of cold mountain travel, they were finally approaching Henry X Snow's place. A cluster of agency buildings came into view, weathered wooden structures flying the American flag. Near them stood a more substantial log house, smoke curling from its stone chimney. As they drew closer, a tall figure emerged onto the porch. Henry X Snow stood watching their approach, his bearing dignified but welcoming. He was a man in his mid-40s, with deep lines of experience around his eyes and an air of quiet authority. When Lucas reined the horse to a stop, Henry's serious expression broke into a warm smile. "Lucas Flint," he called out, stepping down from the porch. "You stay away too long, my friend. The fish in our creek miss your poor attempts at catching them." Lucas dismounted first, then helped Mara down. Her legs trembled from days in the saddle, but she stood straight as Lucas and Henry clasped hands in greeting. "Henry," Lucas said, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Good to see you." Henry's dark eyes took in their trail-worn appearance, the way they both favored their right sides from riding double, and the careful distance Mara kept from strangers. His expression grew more serious. "You have brought trouble with you this time," he observed, then turned to Mara with grave courtesy. "Welcome to my home. I am Henry X Snow." "Mara Ellery," she replied softly. "Thank you for receiving us." Henry nodded. "Come inside. You both look like you could use hot coffee and a proper meal." The interior of Henry's home was warm and well-ordered, with a mixture of native and settler furnishings. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the aroma of cooking stew filled the air. Henry's wife, Sarah, greeted them quietly before returning to her cooking. They settled around the solid table, and Henry poured strong coffee into tin cups. Steam rose in the lamplight as Sarah served bowls of rich venison stew. Only when they had eaten their fill did Henry lean back in his chair. "Now," he said, "tell me what brings you through the snow to my door." Lucas and Mara exchanged glances, then began their story. They started with Lucas finding Mara in the drift, the desperate rescue breath that marked them both with the contact ink. Mara explained about Silas Grady's scheme to frame her, how he had treated her sewing scissors with the invisible marking compound. "The Pinkertons came without proper papers," she said, hands clasped tight around her cup. "I knew if they took me, I'd never get a fair hearing." Henry nodded slowly. "Pinkerton men often forget they are not federal marshals," he commented. "They serve whoever pays them." Lucas described the tracker's visit to his cabin, their assumption that he was the marked thief. Then he pulled out the water-stained ledger page they had found in his pack. "This was my brother's writing," he said quietly. "James worked as a guard at Grady's bank before he died, before he fell from that trestle." Henry studied the columns of numbers, his expression grave. "These show systematic theft," he said, translating the banking terms into plainer language. "Money moved between accounts, taken in small amounts over time. Your brother was documenting proof of embezzlement." "He meant to show it to someone with authority," Lucas said, "but he never got the chance." Mara reached over and touched Lucas's arm briefly. The simple gesture of comfort did not go unnoticed by Henry. "This matches what we have been seeing," Henry said, setting down the page carefully. "Grady has been buying land at very low prices from settlers who suddenly find themselves desperate, and there have been pressures on Apache families who live near the river, good water rights that Grady seems very interested in acquiring." "Can anything be done?" Mara asked, "with the ledger page as evidence?" Henry was quiet for a moment, considering. "As it happens," he said finally, "Federal Circuit Judge Morrison is due to pass through the agency in 3 days' time. He is a fair man, known for looking at evidence rather than reputations." Hope flickered in Mara's eyes. "Would he hear us?" "I believe so," Henry replied. "The ledger page, combined with your testimonies and what we know of Grady's land dealings, it could be enough to warrant a proper investigation." He looked at them both seriously. "But you would need to face Grady directly in the hearing. Are you prepared for that?" Lucas straightened in his chair. "I've been ready since James died." Mara nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "I'm tired of running. I want the truth to be known." As the evening deepened, Henry's extended family began arriving for the night meal. Children darted through the house, while women gathered in the kitchen. Mara rose to help with dishes, and was welcomed into their circle with quiet acceptance. Lucas went outside with Henry to split more firewood for the night. The rhythmic thunk of the axe punctuated their conversation as they discussed the details of approaching Judge Morrison. Later, as the household settled in for the night, Lucas and Mara found themselves alone on the porch. Lantern light spilled through the windows behind them, and the stars were bright overhead. "What kind of life would you have wanted?" Mara asked softly, breaking their comfortable silence. "If things had been different?" Lucas was quiet for a long moment. "Something simple," he finally said. "A cabin with good water nearby. Some cattle, maybe. Someone to share the quiet evenings with." He glanced at her. "You?" "A little house in town," she replied. "My sewing work, but done with joy instead of desperation. Children's laughter. Someone who understands that wealth isn't just about money." Their hands rested on the porch railing, close enough to feel each other's warmth in the cold night air. Neither spoke as their fingers brushed lightly, but something shifted between them, delicate as a butterfly's wing, warm as the hearth fire inside. Finally, Mara shivered in the mountain night air, and Lucas opened the door. They returned to the warmth of Henry's home, carrying that unspoken moment with them like a shared secret, a spark of possibility in the midst of their uncertain future. Inside, Henry looked up from where he sat, cleaning his glasses. Tomorrow they would begin preparing their case against Grady. But for tonight, they had found safe, harbor, and hope. It would have to be enough. Sarah brought them blankets and showed them to their sleeping places, Mara with the women in one room, Lucas with the men in another. As they parted for the night, their eyes met in silent understanding. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Morning sunlight glinted off the snow as Henry 10 Snow led Lucas and Mara toward the reservation schoolhouse. The small wooden building hunched low against the winter wind, its weathered walls stark against the white drifts. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth within. "Schoolmarm Haverty does what she can with limited supplies," Henry explained as they approached. "The missionary pastor Elderson visits twice weekly to assist." Lucas noticed Mara watching a group of children trudging through the snow toward the building, their clothes thin against the cold. Some wore traditional Apache garments mixed with settler cast-offs, others dressed fully in worn Western clothing. All carried that look of making do with less. Henry knocked on the door before leading them inside. The schoolroom's warmth wrapped around them, carrying the familiar scents of chalk dust, wood smoke, and well-worn books. Children sat on rough benches, their attention focused on a tall woman with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun. "And what comes after M?" Mrs. Haverty asked, pointing to letters scratched on the blackboard. "N," the children chorused, their breath visible in the chilly air despite the struggling stove. Pastor Elderson stood near the back of the room, his gentle face creased with concern as he watched the lesson. He nodded a quiet greeting to the visitors. Mrs. Haverty turned at their entrance, her tired eyes brightening. "Mr. 10 Snow, welcome. Are these the friends you mentioned?" "Yes," Henry replied. "Lucas Flint and Mara Ellery. They're waiting to speak with Judge Morrison when he arrives tomorrow." The schoolmarm's smile was warm but weary. "Please, make yourselves comfortable. We're just finishing our letters." Mara found herself drawn to the children's eager faces. Some showed signs of recent illness, others of too little food, but all focused intently on their lessons. A girl near the front, no more than 8 years old, caught Mara's attention. Her dress was clearly hand-me-down, the hem hanging in tatters. The morning lesson continued, moving from letters to simple words. Pastor Elderson stepped forward occasionally to help struggling students, his manner patient and kind, despite his reserved demeanor. Mara noticed how some children whispered in Apache between exercises, sharing translations with their peers. During a brief break, Mara approached Mrs. Haverty. "Would you mind if I helped that little girl with her dress?" she asked softly, gesturing to the torn hem. "I have my needle and thread with me." The schoolmarm's face softened. "That's Sarah Whitewater's girl. I'm sure she'd appreciate it. Their families had a difficult winter." Mara knelt beside the child's bench, speaking gently. "Hello, I'm Mara. Would you like me to fix your dress hem?" The girl nodded shyly, watching with fascination as Mara threaded her needle. Other children gathered around, curious, as she began neat, quick stitches. "Mama says we might have to move soon," a boy nearby murmured in English. "The banker man and landmen want our water place." Henry, overhearing, moved closer. "Many families here face similar pressure," he explained quietly to Lucas and Mara. "Grady works with land speculators, looking for ways to claim water rights and grazing land. The treaties should protect the people. But—" He trailed off, his expression troubled. Mara's hands stilled for a moment as understanding dawned. Her own framing wasn't just about money stolen from the bank. It was part of a larger pattern. Grady used his position to pressure and displace people who couldn't fight back, whether they were poor widows in town or Apache families on the reservation. She resumed sewing with renewed purpose, her stitches small and strong. The little girl touched the repaired hem with wonder when Mara finished. "Thank you," she whispered, then added something in Apache that made Henry smile. "She says your hands are kind," he translated. Throughout the afternoon, they observed more lessons. Mrs. Haverty taught reading and simple sums, while Pastor Elderson led a gentle discussion of biblical parables. Mara noticed how he emphasized stories of justice and mercy, though his manner suggested someone who struggled with speaking out against authority. The children's resilience touched her deeply. Despite their circumstances, they helped each other, shared what little they had, and threw themselves into learning with determination. One boy proudly showed off his English writing, while two girls taught Mara a traditional Apache greeting, giggling when she stumbled over the words. As the winter day began to fade, parents arrived to collect their children. Mara watched them leave in twos and threes, their small forms disappearing into the gathering dusk. Her heart ached thinking of their uncertain futures. The walk back to Henry's lodge was quiet, their boots crunching through fresh snow. Twilight painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, while the first stars pricked through the darkening sky. Near Henry's door, Mara stopped. "I'm done running," she said firmly, turning to Lucas. "This isn't just about clearing my name anymore. Those children, their families, they need someone to stand up to Grady and his schemes." Lucas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "James would have wanted that too. He didn't die just to expose stolen money. He died trying to stop something bigger." "Tomorrow," Henry added, "when Judge Morrison arrives, we'll present not only the ledger evidence, but also testimony about the larger pattern of exploitation. The judge needs to see how Grady's crimes affect the whole community." Mara touched the pocket where she kept her sewing scissors, the ones Grady had used to frame her. "I've been so focused on proving my innocence, I almost missed the bigger picture, but seeing those children today..." She straightened her shoulders. "I want to fight for them too." Lucas watched her with quiet admiration. The woman he'd found half frozen in the snow had transformed into someone stronger, someone whose compassion reached beyond her own troubles. He felt his own heart stirring, awakening from the dormancy that had gripped it since James's death. "The good book talks about defending widows and orphans," he said softly. "About standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. Maybe that's what real faith looks like." Henry smiled at them both as he opened his door. Warmth and lamplight spilled out, along with the sounds of his family preparing the evening meal. "Come in," he said. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. Tonight, we rest and prepare." They stepped inside, leaving the darkening winter evening behind. Tomorrow the judge would arrive, and they would face Grady with not only evidence of his financial crimes, but also the larger truth of his impact on the community. For now, though, they had found their purpose. Not just survival, but justice for all those who had suffered under Grady's schemes. The lodge was warm and welcoming, filled with the scents of cooking and the soft murmur of conversation in English and Apache. As Mara helped set the table, she felt a deep certainty settle in her heart. Whatever happened tomorrow, she was exactly where she needed to be, fighting for what was right. She caught Lucas's eye across the room and saw the same resolve reflected there, along with something warmer that made her cheeks flush despite herself. Henry watched them both with knowing eyes as he hung his coat by the door. Tomorrow would indeed bring its challenges, but tonight they had hope, and sometimes that was the strongest weapon of all. Morning sunlight streamed through the frost-edged windows of Henry's lodge as they finished breakfast. The air held that peculiar winter stillness that made every sound seem sharper. The scrape of chairs, the clink of tin cups, the crackle of the stove. Henry had left earlier to check for any messages at the agency office regarding the judge's arrival. Lucas helped Henry's wife clear the dishes, while Mara folded the blankets from her temporary bed near the hearth. The domesticity of the moment struck her. How natural it felt to share these simple morning tasks, even under such tense circumstances. The front door opened with a burst of cold air as Henry returned, snow dusting his shoulders. His expression was apologetic as he held up a yellow telegram paper. "The judge's wagon is delayed," he announced, stamping his boots. "Bridge washed out along Cedar Creek. They're taking the longer route, but won't arrive until tomorrow." Mara's shoulders slumped slightly, but she nodded. They had waited this long. One more day wouldn't break them. "At least it gives us more time to prepare," Lucas said, his voice steady and practical. "To make sure we present everything clearly." Henry hung his coat by the door. "Agreed. And I could use some help today. Fence near the agency corrals needs mending. The winter's been hard on it." "I'll join you," Lucas offered immediately. Physical work would help pass the hours of waiting. Mara straightened her apron. "I can help with cooking and mending here, if that's all right?" she asked Henry's wife, who smiled warmly and nodded. The day settled into a rhythm of simple tasks. Lucas and Henry walked to the corrals, where broken fence rails needed replacing. The work was straightforward, but demanding. Lifting heavy posts, securing rails, checking for weak spots along the line. Their breath fogged in the cold air as they worked. "Your brother would be proud," Henry said quietly as they levered a new post into position. "Seeing you fight for justice like this." Lucas paused, his hands rough on the weathered wood. "Sometimes I wonder if I could have prevented his death, if I'd been paying closer attention to what was happening in town." "You couldn't have known," Henry replied. "James made his choice to stand against corruption. Now you're carrying that forward." Back at the lodge, Mara found comfort in domestic tasks alongside Henry's female relatives. They showed her their way of making bread, kneading the dough with practiced motions, while teaching her Apache words for flour, water, fire. She helped mend torn shirts and showed them her own neat stitching techniques. Through the window she could see Lucas working at the fence, his movements sure and steady. Her heart quickened whenever she caught glimpses of him, remembering how he'd saved her life that day in the snow. How much had changed since then. The afternoon light was fading when Lucas and Henry returned. After washing up, they gathered around the table for a hearty supper of beans, bread, and dried venison. As they ate, talk turned to tomorrow's presentation to the judge. "We should start with the ledger," Henry suggested, spreading the water-stained paper carefully on the table's edge. "It provides solid evidence of the embezzlement." Lucas nodded. "Then we can show how that connects to the pressure on settlers and the reservation families, the pattern of using debt to seize land." "And my framing fits the timeline," Mara added. He needed someone to blame when questions started arising about missing funds. They discussed the details until the supper dishes were cleared and Henry's family had retired to their rooms. The main room grew quiet, except for the pop and hiss of the fire. Henry excused himself to check on his children, leaving Lucas and Mara alone by the hearth. The lamplight cast a gentle glow, softening the worry lines around Mara's eyes as she stared into the flames. "What if it's not enough?" she whispered. "Grady has so much influence, so many powerful friends." Lucas shifted closer on the bench they shared. "Truth has its own power. My brother believed that. Henry believes it too." "Your brother must have been very brave," Mara said softly. "He was. Quiet about it, but steady in his convictions." Lucas's voice grew distant with memory. "Always stood up for what was right, even as kids." Mara touched his hand gently. Tell me about him." Lucas spoke of childhood adventures, of James teaching him to fish, of their mother's garden and their father's workshop. Mara shared her own memories, her mother's cooking, the sound of her father's laugh before illness took him, the little ways they'd made joy despite being poor. The fire burned lower as they talked, their voices soft in the dim room. Lucas found himself studying Mara's face in the lamplight, the strength in her gentle features, the way her eyes held both sorrow and hope. She met his gaze, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. They leaned closer, drawn by something deeper than the moment. This wasn't like that desperate kiss in the snow. This was deliberate, tender, full of growing feeling. Their faces were inches apart when footsteps sounded in the hallway. They pulled back quickly, both flushing as Henry returned to bank the fire for the night. The moment broke, but something warm lingered in their shared glance. "We should rest," Lucas said, standing somewhat awkwardly. "Tomorrow's an important day." Mara nodded, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. "Yes, we'll need clear heads to face whatever comes." They moved toward their separate sleeping spaces, Lucas to the small back room, Mara to her pallet near the hearth. Despite the interrupted moment, neither felt the usual weight of anxiety about the coming day. Something had shifted between them, as gentle and natural as spring replacing winter. "Good night," Mara whispered as Lucas passed. "Sleep well," he murmured back, his eyes soft in the dying firelight. They retired to their beds, hearts beating with a strange mixture of anticipation and peace. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but tonight they had shared something precious, memories, hopes, and the whisper of deeper feelings, yet unnamed. Whatever challenges awaited with the judge's arrival, they would face them together. The lodge settled into nighttime quiet, broken only by the occasional pop of cooling embers and the distant howl of a coyote. Outside, stars wheeled above the snow-covered valley, and somewhere to the east, a judge's wagon made its slow way toward tomorrow's confrontation with truth and justice. The dark hours before dawn settled heavily over Henry Ten Snow's lodge. Only the faintest red glow remained in the banked coals of the hearth, barely illuminating the main room where Mara slept near the fire. Lucas dozed fitfully in the back room, his mind still turning over plans for the judge's arrival. A soft crunch of snow outside pulled Lucas, instantly awake. Years of mountain living had taught him to read sounds, and this wasn't the step of a single person. Multiple boots moved with purpose through the crusted snow, trying to be quiet but betraying their numbers. He was already reaching for his rifle when the front door exploded inward with a crash that shattered the pre-dawn silence. Cold air and snow swirled in as dark figures flooded the room. Lantern light flared, revealing the professional garb of Pinkerton men, and in their midst, looking pleased with himself, stood Silas Grady. The banker's fine wool coat seemed out of place in the rough lodge. His silver watch chain gleamed as he stepped forward, surveying the scene with cold satisfaction. "Quite the gathering of thieves and malcontents we have here," he said smoothly. Henry burst from his family's room, but before he could speak, one of the Pinkertons raised a revolver. The shot cracked through the lodge like thunder. "No!" Lucas shouted as Henry stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder where blood already darkened his shirt. Lucas lunged forward, but two agents caught him, driving him to his knees with practiced efficiency. His arms were wrenched behind him, rope biting into his wrists as they bound him tight. "Henry!" Mara's cry came from her pallet as rough hands dragged her up. She struggled as they tied her wrists, her face pale with shock and fear in the lantern light. Grady walked to Henry's table where the ledger page lay waiting for the judge. He lifted it with delicate fingers, holding it up to examine in the lamplight. Ah, yes, my former guard's careful accounting. Such a shame about his accident. His eyes met Lucas's with mock sympathy. Your brother never did learn to watch his step around high places. You murdered him, Lucas ground out, straining against the ropes. He found proof of your theft. Proof? Grady's smile was cold as he held the paper's corner to the lamp's flame. I see no proof here. The precious document caught fire, curling and blackening as Grady let it burn. Lucas watched helplessly as their evidence crumbled to ash, scattering across the floor like black snow. Get them loaded up, Grady ordered. Separate wagons. We have a long ride back to Copper Bend. The Pinkertons hauled Lucas to his feet. Outside, 2 wagons waited in the gray pre-dawn light, their horses stamping in the cold. They threw Lucas into the back of one, securing his ankles with iron shackles that clinked dully in the frozen air. Through the swirling snow, he glimpsed Mara being forced into the other wagon, a thin blanket thrown over her shoulders. Her eyes found his for just a moment before a guard blocked his view. Henry, Lucas called out, trying to see his wounded friend. He'll live, Grady said dismissively, though he might want to reconsider his choice of associates in the future. The wagons lurched into motion as the sun began to stain the eastern sky a bloody red. Hour after hour they drove through, the deep snow, the wheels creaking, and the horses' hooves beating a steady rhythm. Lucas's chains rattled with every bump and jolt, the iron slowly leaching away what little warmth remained in his body. They stopped only briefly at midday to water the horses and eat cold salt pork and hardtack. Lucas caught a glimpse of Mara in the other wagon, huddled under her blanket, her face drawn with cold and exhaustion. One of the younger Pinkertons offered her water, but Grady sharply ordered him back to his post. The afternoon stretched endlessly as they pushed on toward Copper Bend. Lucas's wrists were raw from the ropes, his legs cramped from the chains. But worse than the physical discomfort was the knowledge that they had failed. Failed to protect the evidence, failed to reach the judge, failed to stop Grady's schemes that hurt so many. As darkness fell, Grady finally called a halt beside a frozen creek. The wagons creaked to a stop in a small clearing sheltered by bare cottonwoods. The Pinkertons efficiently set up camp, building a fire and posting guards in rotation. They left Lucas chained near the fire, close enough to keep him from freezing but far enough to prevent any hope of escape. Through the flames, he could see Mara in the other wagon, still under guard. Her face was turned away, but he could see how she trembled with cold and fear. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky. Lucas's lips moved in a broken whisper of prayer, not for himself, but for Mara. Please, Lord, he breathed, don't leave her to face this alone. Don't let darkness win. The guards changed shifts as the night deepened. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes began to howl, a wild, lonely sound that echoed off the snow-covered hills. The fire burned lower, casting uncertain shadows through the frozen branches overhead. Lucas shifted against his chains, trying to find a position that hurt less. Each breath clouded in the bitter air as he watched Mara's wagon through the dying firelight. He thought of Henry, wounded but alive, and prayed his friend would find a way to reach the judge despite everything. The coyotes called again, their voices rising and falling like mourners at a wake. The sound seemed to carry all the grief and fear of the long day, the destroyed evidence, Henry's shooting, their capture and separation. Yet somehow, beneath the howling, Lucas felt a spark of stubborn hope refuse to die. He might be in chains, but he wasn't broken. Mara might be captive, but her spirit wasn't crushed. And somewhere in the darkness, truth still waited to be revealed. The fire crackled lower as midnight approached. Guards paced their rounds, boots crunching in the snow. Lucas lay still, conserving his strength, watching the stars wheel overhead through the bare branches. Tomorrow would bring them to Copper Bend, and whatever fate Grady had planned. But for now, in the quiet hours of this long night, Lucas held on to his faith that justice would somehow find its way through the darkness. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Copper Bend's main street as the wagons rolled into town. Wheels creaked through half-melted snow, and curious faces appeared at dusty windows. Shop owners paused in their doorways, and children stopped their play to stare at the procession. Lucas sat stiffly in his wagon, chains clinking with each bump and jolt. His muscles ached from 2 days of restricted movement, but he kept his head high as townspeople whispered behind raised hands. Through the wagon's wooden slats, he glimpsed Mara in the vehicle ahead, her shoulders straight despite her obvious exhaustion. The Pinkerton men brought both wagons to a halt. Lucas's in front of the small jail, Mara's before a shabby 3-story boarding house with peeling paint and crooked shutters. Lucas's heart clenched as he watched 2 agents escort Mara inside, her bound hands hidden beneath the thin blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. "Get moving," one of the Pinkertons ordered, yanking Lucas to his feet. The chains between his ankles forced him to shuffle as they marched him toward the jail's weather-beaten door. Inside, the sheriff's office smelled of wood smoke and old coffee. A pot-bellied stove radiated welcome warmth, but Lucas was given no chance to thaw his frozen limbs. The agents hustled him straight through to the cells in back. "Mind those manacles stay tight," the senior Pinkerton instructed the sheriff. "He's craftier than he looks." The sheriff, a heavy-set man with graying whiskers, barely glanced up from his desk. "He won't be going anywhere." They locked Lucas in the end cell, leaving him still shackled. Through the small barred window, he could see the boarding house where they'd taken Mara. A woman in a dark dress appeared briefly at an upstairs window, a guard, not Mara, before drawing the curtains shut. Across the street, Silas Grady descended from his wagon with the smooth confidence of a man who owned not just the bank, but the whole town's soul. He brushed road dust from his fine coat and strode toward the sheriff's office, his polished boots clicking on the wooden sidewalk. Lucas pressed close to the bars, straining to hear their conversation in the front room. "Everything arranged?" Grady's cultured voice carried clearly. "Judge Warren's due tomorrow morning," the sheriff answered, "though I don't see why we need the appearance of proper procedure matters," Grady cut in. "Even with thieves and frauds. You'll have your hearing room ready by 9 o'clock? A pause, then the sheriff's grudging reply. "Yes, sir. Though about that note coming due next week. We'll discuss your loan extension after tomorrow's business is concluded." Grady's tone left no room for argument. For now, just ensure our prisoners remain secure, especially the mountain man. We wouldn't want him missing his chance at justice. Their footsteps moved away, leaving Lucas alone with his thoughts and the settling darkness. He tested his chains methodically, finding no weakness. When the sheriff made his evening rounds, Lucas tried to engage him in conversation. "Sir, there's evidence you need to see." The sheriff walked past without acknowledging him. "My brother worked at Grady's bank. His death wasn't—" Still no response. "At least tell me if Miss Ellery is being treated properly." The sheriff paused at that, almost turning, but then continued on without a word. Soon, the office went quiet, except for the soft tick of a clock and the occasional rustle of papers. Night settled over the town. Through his window, Lucas could see lights coming on in the saloon across the way. A piano's tinny notes drifted up the street, along with bursts of laughter and the clinking of glasses. In her locked room at the boarding house, Mara knelt on the rough floorboards, her hands clasped tightly. The same music reached her ears, a bitter reminder of the normal life continuing just beyond her reach. Her guard sat in a rocking chair by the door, needlework in her lap, watching Mara's every move with sharp eyes. The room was spare: a narrow bed, a washstand with a cracked mirror, a chest of drawers with a missing handle. But it was the window that drew Mara's attention. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see the jail's outline in the gathering dark. Somewhere in that building, Lucas waited alone, still in chains because he'd tried to help her. She bowed her head, lips moving in silent prayer. After so many years of doubt, the words came hesitantly, but her heart's cry was clear. Please don't let this be how it ends. Miles outside town, Henry 10 Snow rode slowly through the deepening dusk, one arm held carefully against his bandaged shoulder. Beside him, his cousin Two Hawks led their horses with the patience of an experienced tracker. They had followed the wagon tracks all day, moving as fast as Henry's wound would allow. They passed here not 4 hours ago, Two Hawks said in Apache, indicating fresh wheel ruts in the muddy snow. We'll reach the town soon. Henry nodded, conserving his strength. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, and his cousin's knowledge of healing herbs had helped, but the wound still burned with every movement. He thought of Lucas in chains, Mara under guard, and the cruel satisfaction in Grady's eyes as he burned their evidence. The pain in his shoulder seemed small compared to what his friends faced. The lights of Copper Bend appeared ahead just as true night fell. Two Hawks helped Henry dismount in a grove of cottonwoods outside town. I'll wait here with the horses, Two Hawks said. Be careful, brother. Henry clasped his cousin's arm in gratitude, then made his way cautiously toward town, keeping to the shadows. His years of working between two worlds had taught him how to move unseen when needed. He slipped through back alleys, avoiding the brighter streets where he might be recognized. The jail, he paused in a dark doorway, watching. A young deputy, Cal Morgan, emerged to begin his night rounds, looking uncertain in his ill-fitting badge. Henry had seen that look before on men caught between duty and conscience. He waited until the deputy passed close to his hiding place, then spoke softly. A word, if you please. The deputy startled, hand dropping to his gun, but Henry kept his own hands clearly visible. You know who I am? Henry said calmly. And you know something's not right about today's arrests. I can't talk about that. But Cal Morgan didn't move away. The federal circuit judge, Henry continued, would be very interested in how Banker Grady handles justice here, especially regarding tribal lands and water rights. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. That's not my business. A man wearing a badge makes justice his business. Henry's quiet words carried weight. Or do you serve the law, or just Grady's money? Cal Morgan looked down at his scuffed boots. The sheriff says, the sheriff's in debt to Grady, like half this town. Henry touched his wounded shoulder carefully. But federal law stands above local power. You know that's true. A long moment passed. Music from the saloon floated on the cold air. Finally, the deputy spoke barely above a whisper. The sheriff sleeps hard after his evening whiskey. Won't wake until dawn most days. Henry nodded. And the jail keys? Hang behind his desk. Cal Morgan wouldn't meet his eyes. I'm due to check the cells at midnight. Won't take more than 5 minutes. I understand. Henry touched the brim of his hat. Much obliged, deputy. The young lawman hurried away, shoulders tense. Henry melted back into the shadows to wait, his shoulder throbbing in time with his heart. The town slowly grew quieter as midnight approached. The saloon piano fell silent, and most windows went dark. In his cell, Lucas had almost dozed off when he heard the soft scrape of a key in the lock. The young deputy stood in the doorway, holding a ring of keys. Behind him, Henry's familiar figure filled the shadows. "We need to hurry," Cal Morgan whispered, hands shaking slightly as he unlocked Lucas's chains. "The sheriff usually sleeps through, but—" "Thank you," Lucas said quietly as the shackles fell away. He rubbed his raw wrists, then gripped the deputy's shoulder. "You're doing right." They moved silently through the office, past the sheriff's snoring form slumped over his desk. Henry led them out a side door into the freezing alley. Lucas took his first deep breath of free air, then immediately turned to Henry. "We have to get Mara out." "By morning," Henry agreed. His face was drawn with pain, but his eyes were steady. "Grady's arranged a sham hearing for sunrise. We'll need to move fast." They pressed deeper into the shadows of the alley, 3 dark figures planning in whispers, while the town slept uneasily around them. The night was bitterly cold, stars sharp as ice overhead, but dawn was still hours away. Time enough, perhaps, to save one woman and expose one man's cruel empire of lies. Lucas looked toward the boarding house where Mara waited, his heart aching to reach her. They were free but hunted, hope mixed with danger. But for the first time since their capture, he felt the tide beginning to turn. The first pale light of dawn crept over the eastern mountains, painting Copper Bend's frost-covered buildings in weak winter sunshine. Main Street slowly filled as townsfolk gathered, their breath forming clouds in the bitter morning air. Shop owners paused while sweeping their boardwalks, ranch hands delayed their morning duties, and children pressed close to their mothers' skirts, all drawn by the spectacle about to unfold. The boarding house door creaked open. 2 Pinkerton men emerged, flanking Mara Ellery. Iron shackles circled her wrists, the chains clinking with each step. Her blue dress was wrinkled and dirty, her dark hair falling loose around shoulders that stayed straight despite her obvious exhaustion. The agents marched her down the wooden steps and onto Main Street. "Poor thing," whispered Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, yet she stepped back when Mara passed, as if dishonesty might be catching. "Such a shame," murmured another church lady, clutching her shawl tighter. "She seemed so quiet and proper before." The men in the crowd shifted uneasily, some touching their hats in awkward respect before looking away. Too many owed money to Silas Grady's bank to risk showing sympathy to his accused thief. Sheriff Mills walked ahead of the group, his badge gleaming in the early light. The Pinkertons kept pace behind him, hands never far from their holsters. From the bank's broad front steps, Silas Grady watched the procession, his face a mask of righteous satisfaction. His good wool coat and polished boots set him apart from the working folks gathered below. In the livery stable's hayloft across the street, Lucas Flint and Henry Ten Snow crouched low, peering through gaps in the weathered boards. They had spent the remaining hours of darkness there, planning while horses shuffled in their stalls below. Now they wore borrowed coats and wide-brimmed hats pulled low, ready to blend into the crowd. Lucas's chest tightened as he watched Mara stumble on an uneven board. One of the Pinkertons roughly steadied her, making the chains rattle. Her face was pale as milk, dark circles beneath her eyes speaking of a sleepless night, yet she held her head high. The sheriff raised his hands for attention as they reached the middle of the street. "Good people of Copper Bend," he called out, his voice carrying in the cold air. "We're gathered to see justice done. This woman stands accused of theft from our trusted bank. Given the clear evidence against her, she'll be judged and transported to the territorial prison this very day." Lucas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He shared a quick glance with Henry, who nodded, once face grim despite the pain of his wounded shoulder. "No proper trial?" someone in the crowd called out. "The evidence is clear enough," the sheriff answered. "Mr. Grady himself caught her with stolen funds." That was the moment Lucas chose to move. He stepped out from the crowd, straight-backed and deliberate, pulling off the borrowed hat. A gasp rippled through the onlookers as they recognized him. Some backed away, creating a small circle of space around him. "I reckon we ought to examine all the evidence," Lucas said, his quiet voice carrying in the sudden hush, "including the truth about my brother's death at Grady's bank." Henry moved to stand beside him, his own disguise discarded. Despite his injury, he drew himself to his full height, his presence commanding respect from both settlers and the few tribal members in the crowd. "Federal law requires a proper hearing," Henry added firmly, "with all dealings laid bare." Lucas kept his eyes locked on Grady. "All the dealings," he repeated. "Every ledger, every loan, every piece of land bought cheap from desperate folks, every dollar that went missing before my brother died." The crowd's whispers grew louder. The sheriff's hand strayed toward his gun, but uncertainty showed in his face. He looked to Grady for direction. On the bank steps, Grady's expression shifted from smugness to something harder, more dangerous. His eyes narrowed as he realized the simple judgment he'd planned was slipping away from him. The morning sun caught his face, showing lines of tension around his mouth that hadn't been there moments before. The town held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "Let's hear them out proper," someone called from the crowd. "At the church where we can all gather." The sheriff glanced between the growing crowd and Grady, then nodded reluctantly. "To the church steps, then." The morning sun cast long shadows as townspeople moved toward the white-painted church, its bell tower stark against the pale winter sky. Lucas and Henry walked steadily behind Mara and her guards, while Grady followed with barely concealed anger, his boots clicking on the frozen ground. Under the church bell, Lucas faced the gathered crowd. His voice carried clear in the cold air. "My brother Tom worked honest at Grady's bank for 3 years. He knew numbers well, kept his own records of what passed through his hands each day." Lucas pulled out the water-stained ledger scrap they'd found in his pack. "This here shows money gone missing, shows how funds disappeared from widows' accounts, from tribal payments, from honest folks' savings." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Lucas continued, his voice growing stronger. "Tom wrote here that he aimed to show these numbers to a federal man. 2 days later, he was found dead at the bottom of Trestle Creek Bridge." "Accident," Grady cut in sharply. "The bridge was icy that night." "The bridge my brother crossed every day for 3 years without trouble," Lucas countered. "The night before he planned to speak up." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "That was ruled an accident, Flint." "Then let Mara Ellery speak her piece," Henry said firmly. "Let all truth be heard." The Pinkertons reluctantly allowed Mara to step forward, though they kept hold of her chains. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she spoke. "I did alterations and mending for the bank staff. Mr. Grady asked me to repair the office curtains late one afternoon. While I worked, he had my sewing scissors treated with special ink. Pinkerton contact ink that marks anyone who touches it." She looked at Lucas. "The same mark that transferred when—" She faltered, cheeks coloring slightly. "When he saved your life?" Henry finished for her. Next day, Grady claimed bank funds were missing. The Pinkertons came straight to my door, looking for that ink mark, ready to arrest me with no other proof but his word. Some townspeople scoffed, but others frowned thoughtfully. Mrs. Henderson whispered to her neighbor, "She did always do honest work, never charged too much neither." A shuffling movement drew attention to the edge of the crowd. Mr. Dobson, the elderly bank clerk, stepped forward. His thin hands trembled as he clutched his worn leather satchel. I have something to say," he quavered. Years of staying quiet seemed to weigh on each word. "Dobson," Grady snapped. "Get back to the bank." The old clerk straightened his shoulders. "No, sir. I've kept quiet too long." He opened his satchel with shaking fingers and withdrew a folded paper. "I made my own copy of certain entries, years ago. Kept it safe, though it shamed me to stay silent." "Pastor," Henry called, "would you read these figures, so all can hear?" Pastor Elderson took the paper, adjusted his spectacles, and began reading dates and numbers. Each entry matched the missing funds Lucas had described. The crowd grew still as the truth settled over them. "It's lies," Grady snarled. "All of it." His hand moved to his coat. Lucas saw the motion and tensed. "Mr. Grady, you'll not ruin me with these tales." Grady's fingers closed around the grip of his hidden pistol. Women screamed. Men pulled children back. The sheriff reached for his own gun, but he was too far away. Time seemed to stop as Grady's weapon began to clear his coat. Time crystallized in that breath between heartbeats as Grady's pistol cleared his coat. Before his finger could find the trigger, Henry 10 Snow moved like flowing water. His wounded shoulder didn't slow him as he struck Grady's arm aside with practiced precision, following through with a sharp blow that sent the banker's weapon spinning across the wooden church steps. The pistol clattered to a stop at Pastor Elderson's feet. Grady stumbled backward, his face twisting from rage to disbelief. The crowd drew in a collective gasp, and several children clung to their mothers' skirts. The morning sun caught the fallen pistol's barrel, making it gleam dully against the weathered boards. The lead Pinkerton agent stepped forward, his weathered face tight with anger, not at Henry or Lucas, but at the banker who had manipulated his agency. He had been studying Dobson's ledger copy, and the truth of how they'd been used sat bitter in his throat. "My men will stand down," he announced clearly, nodding to his fellow agents. "Mr. Grady, you're under arrest for fraud, attempted murder, and obstruction of justice." He turned to the sheriff. "I trust you'll assist?" The sheriff's face had gone pale as chalk, but he nodded stiffly. "Reckon I will." He moved to help secure Grady, who had begun shouting about conspiracies and lies. "Remove Miss Ellery's chains," the Pinkerton agent ordered, "and Mr. Flint is free to go. All charges are dismissed." He looked directly at Mara. "The agency regrets being used as a tool of persecution." As the shackles fell away from her wrists, Mara rubbed the reddened skin and watched Grady being led toward the jail. The crowd's murmuring grew louder, neighbors turning to each other to piece together years of half-suspected truths. That evening, lanterns glowed warmly through the church's windows as people filed in for an impromptu service. The small space filled quickly, with standing room only at the back. Pastor Elderson stood before his congregation, his lined face solemn yet hopeful. "Today we witnessed the Lord's hand of justice," he began, his voice steady. "We are reminded that he hears the cries of the oppressed and lifts up those who walk in truth." He spoke of mercy, of restoration, and of the community's duty to support those wronged by deceit. Mara sat in a middle pew, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she silently opened her heart to God again, rededicating herself to faith after years of hurt and distance. The familiar words of hymns washed over her like healing water. After the service, people lingered to talk in hushed voices about the day's events. Mara stepped out onto the dark church porch, drawing her shawl close against the evening chill. Lucas followed, his boots scraping softly on the wooden boards. He cleared his throat awkwardly, looking out at the star-scattered sky. "Mara," he began, then paused, searching for words. "That first kiss, it wasn't proper circumstances, saving your life and all." He shifted his weight, running a hand through his hair. But walking this hard road with you since then, seeing your strength and kindness." He turned to face her fully. "I want you beside me, if you're willing. Not because of that desperate moment in the snow, but because of who you are, and all we've faced together." Mara's eyes filled with tears as she considered his words. Home had been such a fragile concept for so long. A series of temporary rooms, always one step ahead of poverty or scandal. But now, looking at Lucas's honest face in the lamplight spilling from the church windows, she felt the word taking on new, meaning solid as earth and bright as hope. Weeks passed like water flowing beneath thinning ice. March brought warmer winds that softened the snowdrifts around Copper Bend, revealing patches of damp earth beneath. Federal agents arrived by wagon, their progress slowed by muddy roads, to pore over Grady's banking records. Telegrams clicked back and forth between the town and territorial offices, each message helping to unravel years of deception. The town breathed easier without Grady's shadow. Shop owners spoke more freely, and families who'd lost land began careful talks about restitution. In the general store, Mara set up a modest sewing corner near the window, where morning light spilled across her work table. She'd rented a small room upstairs, finally having a place to truly call her own. Young women and girls gathered at her table 3 afternoons each week, learning basic stitching and mending. Their laughter and chatter filled the store as needles flashed and thread pulled tight. When Henry brought reservation children to town, Mara repaired their worn clothes without charge, teaching them simple fixes they could manage themselves. Lucas split his time between the mountain cabin and Copper Bend, often riding to help Henry rebuild his winter lodge after the shooting damage. On Sundays, he spoke at church about treating Apache neighbors fairly, his quiet words carrying weight with people who'd known him for years. This particular Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. Lucas and Mara sat together in a middle pew, their shoulders barely touching. Henry Ten Snow nodded greeting from the back row, his presence a reminder of bridges being built between communities. After the service, they stood on the church porch in the spring sunshine. Children played in the muddy street while their parents visited nearby. "Been thinking," Lucas said, his voice gentle. "We could build a cabin halfway between town and the reservation, close enough to help both ways." Mara smiled, understanding his vision. "A place to welcome everyone," she agreed, "where people could meet as neighbors." Townsfolk passed by, offering warm greetings. The contact ink's mark had long since faded, but something deeper had been written on their hearts: trust in God's timing and each other. Lucas turned to face Mara fully. Unlike that desperate first kiss in the snow, this moment was freely chosen. He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, tender and unhurried. She lifted her face to his, returning the kiss with all the promise of their shared future. Around them, spring wind rustled new leaves, and hope bloomed as steady as the seasons change. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.